The story of Jacob is a very important story in the Bible. He had a twin brother by the name of Esau, and there was a great deal of conflict in this family. There was a great deal of contrast in these two young men, these boys as they grew up to be young men. The twin brother, Esau, turned out to be sort of a non-entity so far as the biblical record is concerned. He became the father of a nation called the Edomites. Jacob, on the other hand, became one of the three great patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what we want to do tonight is to take a look at the account that the Bible gives of these two men. A little bit we know about Esau, primarily the things that we know about Jacob, because he really is the important actor in this story. I really believe that as I read from the book of Genesis here, the various things that it says about Jacob and Esau, I have an idea that we're going to be disappointed in some of the things that we learn about this man Jacob. Maybe that's starting off with a negative, I don't know. But at the same time, I think that there's a great lesson that we can learn from this negativity about this man Jacob. As it develops, I think you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. You know, the Bible says that whatever a person sows, that he will also reap. And so Jacob is a good illustration of this. He did some very bad things in his early life, and he lived, unfortunately, to reap some of the harvest of his bad deeds. However, he was recognized as a very great man, and the Jewish people talked about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob quite constantly. So let's begin by talking about the birth of these two babies. They were twins, as I mentioned. In the 25th chapter of Genesis, there's the story of their birth. You see, their mother, Rebekah, they thought that she was barren. She had no children. That's quite a disgrace, or was it quite a disgrace, among the Jewish people. If you didn't have a child, then your family name would not be carried on. And so it was a very important thing, since they put a great deal of emphasis on genealogy and ancestry and this sort of thing. It was a very important thing for them to have children. But Rebekah had no children. And then, lo and behold, she became pregnant. But she was having a difficult time with her pregnancy. And within her body there was a turmoil going on, according to the statement in the 25th chapter here of Genesis. And this turmoil, she spoke to the Lord about it, and the Lord said, there are two nations in your womb. And these two nations says, there are two nations in your womb, two people from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Well, now that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because in ancient days, and even in some cultures today as well, the older son gets preferential treatment. In the design that they had for ancient people, many times the older son in many of the different cultures of the world, not just the Jewish culture, but in many of the Middle Eastern cultures of the world, the oldest son got 2/3 of the estate, and the others divided the 1/3. And so there was a great deal of preferential treatment here about this. But an interesting thing about the birth of these two boys was that when the first son was born, the second followed very quickly, and the first was Esau, and his hand had hold of the heel of his brother, his brother twin. And so they named the first one, they named him Esau, which was a word that probably meant red. Esau was a very hairy person, a very hairy baby. And He was an outdoorsman when he grew up and so forth. Jacob, on the other hand, he had hold of his heel, and so they named him Jacob because this word in the Hebrew language, this name meant the one who holds the heel. But there's something interesting there because the word came to mean a deceiver. And so Jacob was given the name as a deceiver. Well, it's very unfortunate, but that held true for this man, for this fellow Jacob. Rebekah loved Jacob, the mother. She loved Jacob because he was a kind of a quiet person, the Bible says, and he dwelled in the tents and things like this. I don't know what that says to us about the individual. It doesn't mean that he was not ambitious or anything like that, because we find out later that he was very ambitious, but he had a different personality. On the other hand, Esau was an outdoorsman. He was a big hunter, and his father, Isaac, had also been an outdoorsman, and so it says that Isaac, his father, loved Esau, and Rebekah, the mother, loved Jacob. Do you see what I'm talking about? Contrast and conflict. You see what's happening in this family? Well, one day Esau had been out hunting. And this is a familiar story to us, but I want to put these things together so we'll see a picture of these two guys. He had been out hunting, and he came back in and he was just worn out. He hadn't had anything to eat and all this sort of thing. And you know what Jacob's doing? Jacob is at home making some stew. And so he's stirring up this stew, you know. And Esau comes in and says, "Oh, give me some of your stew." What did Jacob say? "I will if sell me your birthright. I will give you stew if you will give me your birthright." Well, the birthright was a very important thing, the right of the oldest child. He had many rights in the family, and then at the death of the father, he had additional rights. And so Jacob says, "Sell me your birthright, and I'll give you some stew." And so Esau Esau seemed to be not a very good reasoning man. He said, "Well, if I don't get something to eat, I'm going to die. So what good is my birthright going to be then?" So he goes ahead and he sells his birthright. But then later, of course, he resented this whole thing very, very much. Now, I want you to keep that in mind, because we're going to see in this man Jacob a man who in his early days was a very deceitful person, a very deceitful man. And we're going to see in his later life how some of the same things that he had done to his brother were done to him. And so he gives us a good lesson about this whole thing of sowing and reaping. Well, we don't know very much about these two young men as they grew up, except when Isaac thought that he was going to die before very long. The father, he thought he was going to die before very long. He had become blind, and it was a custom in many of the Middle East countries. It was a custom for the father to gather his children around him and pronounce a blessing on each one of the children. And he would start with the oldest and go to the youngest. The oldest always got the greatest blessing, you see. And so he told Esau, he said, "Esau, go out hunting and kill an animal, bring the animal back, cook the animal up, make me some savory food that you know I love." So Isaac went out, and he was going to hunt for an animal. Well, Rebekah was the mother of these two boys. Rebekah came to Jacob and said, "Jacob, I'll tell you what, let's do. Your father's blind. Go to your father, tell him that you are Esau, and get the blessing. Well, Jacob said, yeah, Mom, that's not going to work. Why? Well, it's not going to work because he's a hairy man, and my arms are smooth. So she said, I'll tell you what we'll do. I'll go out there and kill one of our own animals, and we make the stew, make some food out of this, and then I'll take some of the skin and put it around your arms so that if your father feels it, he will feel the hair. So, in the 27th chapter of the book here of Genesis, we have this story, and Jacob goes before his father Isaac, and his father hears him come in, I guess, and says, "Who are you?" He says, "I am Esau, your firstborn son." He said, "Are you already back from your hunting trip?" He said, "That was quick." And then Jacob said, "The Lord blessed the field, and I found an animal quickly." Well, of course, that was a lie. He said, "Come a little bit closer." And he did. He said, "Let me feel your arm." And he felt his arm, and he said, "You know, I can smell the field. You've been in the field." Well, of course, that's what he smelled. But he said, "You've been in the field, and God has blessed the field with you." But he said, I've got a problem. He said, "You sound like Jacob, but you feel like Esau." And so then he pronounced a great blessing. Thinking it was Esau, he pronounced a great blessing on Jacob. And he said, the smell of my son is like the smell of the field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you heaven's dew, and of the earth's richness, and abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you, and people bow down to you. Be the Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. Well, that's pretty strong words, isn't it? And this is the blessing that he pronounced on this fellow Jacob. And then Jacob left, in comes Esau. And Esau says, "I am here for the blessing. I've got the animal," and so forth. And it says that when this happened, Isaac trembled tremendously. And he said, "But I just gave you the blessing." And then it all develops. Jacob had stolen the blessing from his brother Esau. Now, ancient people did this in a prophetic way. And when they pronounced a blessing, they believed that that blessing would come to pass. And that seems to be the very thing that Isaac has reference to here. And so he goes ahead and he blesses Esau, but he says, "There's not very much left for you, Esau. I made you your brother's servant. I pronounced a great blessing on him that nations would bow down to him. There's not very much left for me to bless you with." Well, he gave him what he could. Now, Esau, I don't know whether Esau said this to Jacob or not, but apparently he did. He said, "After our father dies, I'm going to kill you." Well, the reason that it seems that was the thing, because Jacob told Rebekah that. And Rebekah says, "Okay, another plan." Rebekah says, because you see, Rebekah loved Jacob more than she did Esau. So said, "Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to go to your father, and I'm going to say, 'Oh, Isaac, I'm so afraid that Jacob is going to marry one of the women here in the country where we live instead of going back to our own ancestors.'" said, I want us to send Jacob back to Syria, where they came from. I want to send him back to Syria and let him marry someone within our clan. Well, okay, that's all right. Now, an interesting thing here, this is kind of a sidelight, but it's an interesting thing, and I think it's really worth something to us. When Rebekah said, I don't want him to marry among the people of this nation where we are, she said, among the children of Heth, or as other translations say, the Hittites. The children of Heth were a nation called the Hittites. Interesting thing right here. Up until the early 1900s, about 1906, nobody in history ever heard of the Hittites. They were thought to be a non-existent entity. It was a biblical thing, and so the Bible's wrong, and the Bible talks about the Hittites, and there never was a nation called the Hittites. In 1906, there was a man by the name of A.H. Sacey, and he was digging around in a portion of Syria there, and he came upon the ruins of an ancient civilization. And as he was an archaeologist, and as he was digging around in all of this, he began seeing that this was a significant civilization. He discovered some plaques and things like this, and yes, but he didn't know who they were. And then in the 1920s, a German archaeologist by the name of Winkler, he went over there and started digging around in the same places. It's near a present-day village called Bogus Coy. And he was digging around in this, and you know what he found? He found about 10,000 tablets that were engraved, and scholars learned to read that language. And lo and behold, what is it? This is a history of the Hittite people. You know, the Bible, there are a number of things like that where the Bible has made a statement, and historians have said, no, that never happened. No, that never existed. And then discoveries are made by archaeologists that show the Bible was right all the time. Now, I could give you, well, I think I will. I think we've got a little extra time here. There was a place in Thessalonica where the Bible talks about the rulers of the city being called politarchs. And historians said, no, the rulers of that city were never called politarchs. That's sort of like saying, well, who is the president of California? Well, California doesn't have a president. It has a governor. So it was the wrong statement. And they talked about the inaccuracy of the Bible and the unreliability and so forth. And so, lo and behold, they were doing some construction work and building and so forth, and digging up in the old ancient city there of Thessalonica. They came upon a portion of the entrance to the city. Guess what? Engraved in one of those columns was the name of a man who was the politarch of the city. They found out, yes, the rulers of this city were called politarchs. In the book of Isaiah, there's a statement made about a king of Assyria by the name of Sargon. Well, Sargon was not known in any history of Assyria. Nowhere has anything ever been found out about Sargon until in the 1800s. A British archaeologist was digging around in ancient Assyria, and he came upon a palace. And he dug around with this palace. They uncovered a lot of the ruins of this palace, and lo and behold, guess what? They found out this is the palace of Sargon. And they found plaques and they found tablets that were all engraved and so forth. And now we find out that not only did Sargon exist, but we've got a whole lot of history about Sargon. Folks, the Bible is right. The Bible is right. The history in the Bible is right. Well, I just kind of threw that in at no extra charge, okay? But let's get back to our story for just a moment. It's important that we know something about these Hittites that I spoke to you about, because they played a very important role in the history of Israel. They occupied a great part of the land of Palestine for a long time, and they were the dominant people in Palestine for a long time, beginning about the time of Abraham. Okay, back to Jacob and his trip. Jacob made a trip back up into Haran. Haran was in modern-day Syria, and there was an area there that was called Padan Aram, or Padan Aram, I think is the way they really pronounce the thing. But this Padan Aram was a portion of Syria, and this is where Abraham had lived for a while in the city of Haran. And his brothers were there, and his father had died there. And you know, it was an area where the clan of Terah, Abraham's father, where the clan of Terah had settled, and they were still there. And so Jacob found them. Rachel came out to water the sheep, a flock of sheep. And he found out this lady is one of my kinsperson. She's one of my distant cousins. Well, she was invited to come, he was invited to come and live with Laban. And Laban was his distant uncle. And so he started to work for Laban. And then he said, Laban, I want to marry your daughter Rachel. Okay, fine. So they had the wedding, and you remember that not only now, but then the women wore veils, and they wore something that was almost like a burqa, and they were completely covered in all of this. And so that's the way the wedding came off, and Jacob married. But all of a sudden he discovers now this is not Rachel, this is Leah, her sister. And so he married the wrong woman. You see some of the things that he had done early. He's reaping the things that he had sown. He's now being deceived, similar to the way he had deceived his own brother. And so he goes to Laban and he says, what in the world is going on? You gave me the wrong daughter. He says, well, we've got a custom. You always have to marry the oldest daughter first. But he says, I'll tell you what I'll do. You work for me for 7 years, and I'll give you Rachel. Well, he had already worked 7 years, he thought, for Rachel, and now he has to work 7 more years for Rachel. Well, at any rate, he did. He married Rachel. But you see, he really loved Rachel. He was in love with Leah. But there was a bad thing that took place here, because Leah could have children. Rachel could not. A lot of competition developed there. A lot of conflict developed within the family. And Leah had children. Rachel had no children. Well, the custom in those days was that if you could not have children, you could get a surrogate. A little bit like what's done today, not exactly, but you could get a surrogate. And so she got a surrogate, her handmaid, her servant. And Jacob had a child from that relationship. Well, Leah quit having children. Leah gave Jacob her maidservant. and children were raised from that relationship. And then finally Rachel had a child by the name of Joseph. She had another child later by the name of Benjamin, but she died in childbirth at that time. Well, now you see some of the things that are developing here. They grew up, or they began growing up, and there was conflict in the family. Jacob and Laban, that he was working for, his father-in-law, they started having conflict. And so Jacob got all the stuff together that he had accumulated, and he decided he would leave. And he did. He left with all of his goods. Laban found out that he was leaving, and so he chased him on the path there, and he stopped him. He said, "Why are you leaving?" And then this thing was settled, but they made an agreement that they would not harm each other or anything like that. And so Jacob goes on back to his home. Well, he got a problem there, though, because when he started back to his own home, Esau was not in a very good mood there when they had left. Esau was going to kill Jacob, you remember? Isaac had not died yet, but Jacob went on back, and he decided, maybe I better send a gift ahead. And so, now stop and think about this for a minute, because Jacob had become a very wealthy man by this time. How do we know that? Well, because he was going to give a gift to his brother. A peace offering, if you want to call it that, so that his brother would not kill him. I'm not going to read this, but if you sit down and read it, this is what you'll find out. That in Genesis chapter 32, he gives a list of the animals that he sent as a gift. Guess how many there were? I counted them. 550. 550 animals that he gave to his brother as a gift. Now, I don't know about you, but I never have given a person a gift where it really was a big part of my total worth. No, I'm not worth very much, but I don't give very big gifts either. But this was a gift. And Esau and Jacob made up, but Jacob was a little bit squeegee about this, so Jacob did not live right there close to him. I can understand that. But there was conflict in the family. Rachel was the one that was loved. She had died in childbirth, Benjamin. And Joseph was the firstborn of he and Rachel. And so Joseph was the fair-haired boy. He was the favorite child. Now, these brothers that came from these 4 relationships here, these brothers became the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And now these 12 sons were the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. That was the beginning of the Israelite nation. Well, Joseph said to his brothers one day, I had a dream. What'd you dream? Well, I dreamed that we were all out in the field, and we were taking care of the cows, and all of your cows bowed down to my cows. And then he said, we were gathering grain, and all of your grain bowed down to my grain. That made him mad. And as a matter of fact, he says, I saw the sun, the moon, and the stars, and they were bowing down to me. You can imagine where there was already jealousy, you know. You can just imagine what a terrible impression this left. And so they hated Joseph. Well, the brothers were out keeping the flocks of their father, and Joseph was not quite old enough to be active in that yet. But Jacob said to Joseph, Joseph, let me give you some food supplies. Go down to find out how your brothers are getting along, because they had led the flocks quite a ways off. So he did. He went down there, and he had a coat. It was called a coat of many colors. And the brothers saw him coming, and they said, oh me, here comes this dreamer. What are we going to do with him? Said, why don't we just kill him? We get rid of him. We won't have any more trouble. Well, one of the brothers decided, no, let's don't kill him. Let's just throw him in this pit over here, apparently an open cistern. So they did. They threw him in the pit. Well, that brother who had befriended him was off for just a little while, and here came a caravan by on its way to Egypt. And so they sold their brother, Joseph, as a slave to the caravan on its way to Egypt. Well, I'm not going to have time to tell the whole story of Joseph, but you know something? They went back and told their father that here is a coat that we found, and they had put blood all over this coat. And they said, do you know whose coat this is? Well, of course he knew it was. It was Joseph's coat. And so Jacob spent a long time, number of years, believing that his son Joseph was dead, had been eaten up by a wild animal. And he mourned and mourned for his son. It was not until many years later that they found out that Joseph was really one of the rulers of Egypt. And you remember the story of how the whole family went down into Egypt. And that was the end of the story of Genesis and the story of Esau and Jacob. Let's draw just a couple of observations from this as we close. Whatever you sow, that's what you're going to reap. We need to remember that when we treat people in ill ways, we're ultimately going to probably be treated in ill ways too. When we abuse other people, we're probably going to end up being abused ourselves. When we are good to people, when we're honest with people, we'll find that people will respect that, and they're more likely to be good to us. It doesn't work every time that way. But that's the idea. Joseph spent a lot of the early part of his life in deceit, deceiving Esau twice. And in his later life, he found out, hey, that's the way I'm being treated. I'm being deceived, and I'm being abused. And so there's a great lesson here in the idea that what we sow, we're going to reap. And then there's another, I think, very important principle, and I can't say that I fully understand this, but nevertheless it's true, that with all of his faults, with all of his shortcomings, with his deceit, Jacob, nevertheless, is spoken of in the Bible as being a chosen man of God. It doesn't mean that the chosen man of God has no faults, but it does mean that no matter who I am, no matter who you are, no matter what our station in life might be, and no matter what our past life might be, if we give ourselves to God, God can use us. Now, my objective in this sermon was to lightly touch on those things. But what I really wanted us to see was how God used the various events of the lives of Esau, Jacob, and the 12 brothers, how he used these events to ultimately bring Christ into the world. Because it was through this lineage that Jesus Christ was born. I might find a great deal of fault with a great number of people, but I need to remember something. Somehow, and I do not know how, but somehow God may be using that person to teach me a lesson, to help me in my own life. And so, let's not judge the other person. Let's let that remain with God. God is the judge, and God will be the one to decide. We're going to sing an invitation song. If you're not a Christian tonight and you want to become a Christian, be baptized into Christ, we invite you to come. Let's stand together, please.